on June 5, 1947, while speaking at Harvard University, US Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a foreign aid package for Europe to stimulate European production post-World War II. The aim was to stabilize the overall European economy and increase trade among European countries and the rest of the world. This plan of European economic recovery came to be known as the Marshall Plan. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a closer look at the Marshall Plan, its conception, its implementation, and the end result post-implementation. Europe had endured years of food shortages, unemployment, and other hardships during the course of World War II. Industrial production post-World War II had started improving, but the conditions were still dire in Belgium, France, West Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. And because of this, there were concerns about class divisions increasing, leading to political instability. While many leaders were of the opinion that Europe needed to be left alone and bear the cost of reconstruction post-World War II, there were many who felt that doing so would create the same conditions that led to World War II in the first place. The chief concern, though, in the United States was the growing threat of communism across Europe. The Truman Doctrine, enunciated in March 1947, stated that it was US policy to provide support to nations threatened by communism. Already, communist parties in countries like Italy and France were gaining momentum. And if Europe experienced an economic collapse, there was a high possibility that its political institutions would be taken over by communists. The US vision post-World War II was a free Europe in an open world economic system. And to facilitate that, the United States had to intervene. So as the US political leaders and the administration got together to conceive the plan, there were three major hurdles that needed to be overcome. The first was within Europe itself. That is, the participating European nations had to come together and agree on a plan. And once this agreement was reached, the Truman administration and Congress had to agree on the legislative aspects of the program. And the third, the most important, was to come up with a plan which would provide a cure rather than be a mere palliative, according to George Marshall himself. Most of the European nations responded very favorably to the program. And the United States, on purpose, did not exclude any European country from this program. The Cold War was in a very initial stage, and the United States did not want to pass the message that they were trying to isolate the Soviet Union. So Britain and France included the Soviets in an early three-power discussion of the proposal. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov agreed to a meeting on June 27 with his British and French counterparts to discuss the European reaction to the American offer. Molotov's biggest gripe against this plan was that it was providing financial aid to Germany as well. The Soviets did not want Germany to prosper and become an industrialized nation again post-World War II because they had suffered massive casualties during World War II and squarely blamed Germany. So the Soviets wanted full control and freedom of action over any Marshall Plan funds meant for Germany. And the reason for this was they were planning on making Germany an agrarian economy. So their intent was to ensure that none of these funds meant for Germany went towards building an industrial infrastructure. And lastly, the Soviets wanted to have full visibility into the funds the United States would be giving each country in Europe. France and the United Kingdom did not agree with Molotov's objections, and subsequently he stormed out of this meeting on July 2, 1947. Wait, So, had the United Kingdom and France agreed with Molotov, there was a possibility that the Soviets would have participated in the Marshall Plan? Not really. This was just a ploy of Stalin to get information about the Marshall Plan. And once the Soviets had enough information, Molotov was asked to withdraw from the talks. Subsequently, the Soviets pressured their Eastern European allies to reject the Marshall Plan and came up with their own version called the Molotov Plan. Under the Molotov Plan, the Soviets were planning to provide economic assistance to their Eastern European allies to rebuild their economies post-World War II. Meanwhile, on the Western Europe front, 16 nations attended a conference in Paris on July 12, 1947. In software engineering terms, they were coming up with the requirements for this program. The Committee of European Economic Cooperation, or CEEC, was established to gather information on European requirements and the existing resources needed to meet the objectives of the plan. Its final report was submitted in September of 1947, and it called for a 4-year program. And in these 4 years, production would be increased, internal financial stability improved, economic cooperation among the participating countries established with an aim of solving the deficit problem with the American dollar zone. Europe's net balance of payments deficit with the dollar zone for the 1948 to 51 period was estimated at roughly $29 billion. But the report requested $19 billion in US assistance, and an additional $3 billion was expected to come from the World Bank and other sources. So a total of $22 billion as part of the Marshall Plan. On the American side, the biggest hurdle towards implementation of the plan was that Democrat President Harry Truman was facing a Republican majority Congress. And many members in this Congress were highly skeptical of the need for further foreign assistance. And to overcome these hurdles, Harry Truman was able to rise to the occasion and display some amazing leadership and ownership skills. He followed a two-pronged approach. Firstly, he opened his foreign policy initiative to a very thorough examination prior to launching any program. And secondly, he provided a rare process of close consultation between the executive and the Congress. When the legislation finally went to the floor of the Congress, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Arthur H. Vandenberg, who was a Republican, called it the final product of 8 months of more intensive study by more devoted minds than I have ever known to concentrate upon any one objective in all my 20 years in Congress. Now, while Congress was debating the proposal and the overall execution plan, the situation in a few of the countries in Europe deteriorated further. So President Truman called for an interim special aid package to let these countries sustain through the winter with food and fuel. Subsequently, Congress approved an interim aid package to France, Italy, and Austria amounting to $522 million, and this was signed by President Truman on December 17, 1947. In those times, the request for a $22 billion aid package was huge, and Harry Truman wanted to make sure that the American people were also on board with this plan. But the public opinion polls in fall of 1947 showed that half of Americans had heard of the Marshall Plan, and those who had were mostly opposed. So Harry Truman embarked on a huge public education campaign. A major PR effort was sponsored, and government officials, including many cabinet members, crossed the country giving speeches in support of the plan. By December 1947, 2/3 of Americans had heard of the plan, and only 17% were opposed. When it came to the actual implementation of the program, the need for 2 implementing organizations was identified one American and one European. Between them, the two organizations were expected to continue the dialogue on European economic problems, coordinate aid allocation, ensure that the aid was appropriately directed, and negotiate the adoption of effective policy reforms. The central organization was set up by US Congress, and it was called the Economic Cooperation Administration, or ECA, to implement the Marshall Plan. The ECA set up a 600-person regional office in Paris, and its primary role was to coordinate the programs of individual countries and obtain European views on the implementation. So it's impressive that the leaders of the plan recognized the importance of a regional presence to make the execution of the program more effective. And the corresponding European arm was the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, or OEEC, and its primary purpose and focus was to monitor and influence the effective implementation of the program. So the OEEC developed analysis of economic conditions and needs and formulated a plan of action, influenced the direction of investment projects, and encouraged joint adoption of policy reforms so that the intra-European trade barriers could be eliminated. Also, working closely with the ECA, the OEEC recommended and coordinated the division of aid among the 16 countries. Every year, the participating countries would submit a yearly program to the OEEC, which would then make recommendations to the ECA. The Marshall Plan aid was divided among the participating states roughly on a per capita basis. A larger amount was given to the major industrial powers, and the thought process there was that the resuscitation of these economic powers was essential towards the overall revival of Europe. And as expected, the aid was a little more biased towards the allied nations, and comparatively lesser aid was directed at the Axis powers, or those that had remained neutral during World War II. An interesting element of the aid was the concept of counterpart funds. That is, each country was required to match the US grant contribution. And this contribution from the participating country was placed in a counterpart fund that could be used for infrastructure projects. But these projects had to be approved by the ECA administrator. In case of Great Britain, counterpart funds were deemed inflationary and just returned to the national treasury to help balance the budget. By the end of December 1951, approximately $7.6 billion of counterpart funds were approved for use. $2 billion of these were used for debt reduction, as in the case of Great Britain, and roughly $4.8 billion were earmarked for investment. And out of the $4.8 billion, 39% were used in utilities, transportation, and communication projects, 14% in agriculture, 16% in manufacturing, 10% in coal mining and other extraction industries, and 12% in low-cost housing facilities. Less than 0.5% of Marshall Plan aid was earmarked for technical assistance, meaning US experts were to visit Europe to provide training with respect to industrial productivity, marketing, agricultural productivity, manpower utilization, public administration, tourism, transportation, and communications. Midway through this program, as part of technical assistance, about 350 experts from the United States had been sent to Europe to provide these services, and 481 people from Europe had come to the United States for training. Through the course of the program, there were some tensions as well with respect to compliance. For example, Italy was threatened with loss of aid for not acting to adopt the recommended programs. And the ECA mission in Germany withheld the Marshall Plan aid until the German National Railway agreed to balance their budget. So was the Marshall Plan able to achieve its primary objectives? Looking at the data, it does appear so. For example, the production objective of the Marshall Plan was an increase in aggregate production across Europe to the 1938 pre-war levels of 30% in industry and 15% in agriculture. By the end of 1951, industrial production for all countries was 35% above the 1938 level, exceeding the goal of the program. However, aggregate agricultural production was only 11% above the pre-war levels. And given a 25 million rise in population during these years, Europe was not able to feed itself by 1951. But viewed in terms of increase from 1947, the achievement is really impressive. Industrial production by the end of 1951 was 55% higher than only 4 years earlier. Aggregate agricultural production was 37% higher in the 3 crop years after 1947-48. The total GNP rose by roughly 33% during the 4 years of the Marshall Plan. In terms of the overall balance of trade, the deficit vis-à-vis the dollar area was approximately $8 billion in total gold and dollar deficit in 1947. By 1949, it had dropped to $4.5 billion, and by 1952 to half that figure. By the first half of 1953, the deficit had reached an approximate current balance with the dollar area, a huge achievement. In terms of trade liberalization, in 1949, the OEEC had asked members to take steps to eliminate import restrictions. By 1955, 90% of the restrictions were gone. And in terms of intra-European trade, by the end of 1951, trade volume within Europe was almost double that of 1947. One of the fundamental goals of the Marshall Plan was the containment of communism in Europe, and the success on the economic front ensured that that objective was met as well. It is estimated that the communist strength in Western Europe declined by almost one-third between 1946 and 51. In the 1951 elections, the combined pro-Western vote was 84% of the electorate. However, the biggest beneficiary of the Marshall Plan was the United States itself. And that was both on the economic as well as the political fronts. On the economic front, an estimated 70% of European purchases using ECA dollars were spent in the United States. Types of commodities purchased from the United States included foodstuffs like grain and dairy, cotton, fuel, industrial and raw materials like iron and steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, and industrial and agricultural machinery. The bulk of the purchases outside the United States included sugar and non-ferrous metals. So in the end, the US industrial and agricultural sector, which was running full steam after World War II, got a ready market in Europe for its industrial and agricultural output. There was also a high degree of US investment in Europe, which ultimately led to a huge economic interdependence between the two continents. The OEEC in 1961 became the OECD, that is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, with the United States becoming a full member. And the OECD facilitated the evolution of a relationship between US and Europe centered on military and security issues. And this relationship came to be known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. With the success of the operational methods and programs devised and tested during the Marshall Plan, the ECA was established as an independent agency with a mission to ensure close interaction between the government and the private sector in each participating country. And this model was later adopted by the US Agency for International Development, or USAID. With 5% of US GDP distributed successfully to 16 participating European nations, the Marshall Plan is often viewed as a role model for several aid programs across the globe. Starting with the leadership of President Harry Truman, who displayed full commitment to the program despite the opposition having majority in Congress and an election year where the outlook was not very favorable to the president, the administration decided that it was the right thing to do and led a campaign to get the country on its side. With the creation of the OEEC, the administration ensured that Europe had a voice at the table to influence how the aid would get distributed across various sectors of the economy. And very clear goals at the outset ensured that all the participating nations were tracking their progress. So goals like getting the industrial output at the pre-war levels and boosting intra-European trade were clear targets, and these ultimately ensured that all the participating countries were working together as a team to achieve these goals. And that ultimately ensured that the participating nations felt a sense of ownership of the program and the goals associated with the program. And finally, by releasing the aid in yearly increments, Congress and the administration ensured that the progress of the plan was being monitored and any adjustments needed were being accommodated in the yearly disbursements. So it is truly remarkable that the administration in 1948 was able to recognize the importance and effectiveness of iterative planning and implementation, even with aid programs. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. As restrictions around campaign contributions started getting lax, both political parties stretched them to their limits, with one president awarding big donors with overnight stays in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House during his re-election bid. Who was that president? During his 1996 re-election bid, Bill Clinton had some of his big donors stay in the Lincoln bedroom of the White House. So the answer is D, Bill Clinton. Question for the current episode. Which Eastern European country voted overwhelmingly in its parliament to join the Marshall Plan, but was pressured by the Soviet Union to drop out? Was it A, Hungary, B, Czechoslovakia, C, Yugoslavia, or D, Ukraine? Once again, which Eastern European nation voted overwhelmingly to join the Marshall Plan, but was pressured by the Soviet Union to drop out? Was it A, Hungary, B, Czechoslovakia, C, Yugoslavia, or D, Ukraine? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We'll meet again in 2 weeks' time with another interesting and exciting episode related to world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.